Well, let me explain a couple of things. As a lot of you know, I have a book coming out, and the name of the book is The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, My Life with Terrence McKenna, is the subtitle, and as you know, I'm Terrence's brother, and we shared many interests and ideas and adventures over the years. And Terrence has told his story, mostly in True Hallucinations. If any of you are familiar with that book, that's sort of his narrative of our trip to the Amazon in 1971. We had a lot of passion and we were in search of exotic, orally active forms of DMT. And we stumbled on a paper by R.E. Schultes about Verola as an orally active form of DMT, which I talked about this morning, the ukuhe. We thought that must have been the Holy Grail, and so that's what focused us and determined that we would go to La Chorrera. Well, when we got to La Chorrera, the objective to find ukuhe sort of got shoved aside when we found that La Chorrera was in the middle of about 300 acres of pastures in which they had cebu cattle, and there were huge big clusters of psilocybin Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms growing out of every cow pie. And we kind of got into that as a recreational thing initially while we were waiting for the real mystery, but it quickly emerged that the mushrooms were the real mystery. And we got into some very, very, very peculiar cognitive places, which I'm not going to talk about today, actually, because it's too complicated. I was going to talk about what is known in, I guess, the annals of psychedelic literature, the community as the experiment at La Chorrera. And it's discussed in the book. By the way, I should mention, why did I call it The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss? Well, it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing at the time. I mean, both Terrence and I were both Irish, obviously, in the same family, and we had kind of a sense of humor about what we were doing. We took ourselves very seriously when we went down there, but at the same time, not so seriously. We grew up with science fiction, and we were fans of H.P. Lovecraft. If you know H.P. Lovecraft, the horror writer from the 20s, and he was always talking about, the gibbering horror from beyond the stars, the screaming abysses of unimaginable, all this stuff. So we were kind of steeped in that in a sense. So when we went down to the Amazon, we said, we're the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. And I chose that for the title of the book. Well, we had no idea, right, how much of an abyss we would plumb. But the sections in my book that talk about this are kind of long, and you kind of have to lay the groundwork of what we were doing. You have to kind of explain what was going on, and that takes a long time. And then I was going to unpack it. So I decided not to talk about that because our time is limited today. What I am going to talk about is flash forward from 1971 to 1991. And at that time, the Screaming Abyss was well behind us. And I was working as a research pharmacologist at a startup company in California called, appropriately enough, Shaman Pharmaceuticals. And it was a drug discovery company, not ethnobotany-driven drug discovery company, not interested in psychoactives per se, but interested in plumbing the sort of the biodiversity of the rainforest to find new medicines for various applications. And so I was working there, and I had published my thesis work on ayahuasca at that time, and so I had some credibility in the field. And so I received out of the blue at this time an invitation from the UDV, which is the Brazilian church, one of the syncretic churches that uses ayahuasca ceremonially. And they invited me to a conference they were holding in Sao Paulo that summer. they wanted me to present, and they invited a number of other people involved in the ayahuasca field at that time, and they asked us to come and present our research. So I was there. I was probably the only ethnopharmacologist, but I was there with a number of physicians and ethnobotanists and anthropologists and people from various disciplines, and we all gave talks, right? Turned out that what was really going on with their organizing of this conference was they had an agenda with the Brazilian drug regulatory authorities, the organization called CONFEN, to get approval for their use of ayahuasca in a religious context. And there was consideration in the government at that time to prohibit this. They wanted to bring a bunch of people from outside, so-called experts, and have a big conference and impress the regulatory authorities. And to say, well, this isn't really a drug of abuse, this is not a problem. So they held this conference. So it had as much of a sort of political subtext as it did a scientific subtext. So I went down and we had a very stimulating 2 or 3 days like this days, many PowerPoint presentations and talks and a lot of discussions in the corridors and that sort of thing at one of the UDV temples outside Sao Paulo. And there were, maybe a couple of hundred people that attended this, mostly members of the UDV. And then at the end of the conference, as the sort of final climax of the conference, they had organized a group session of ayahuasca for everyone, the visitors, the dignitaries. It was very strange to think of myself as a dignitary, but I guess I was, along with the others, and many of the local members of the UDV church. So we, at the end of the conference, we all gathered in this temple to take ayahuasca. And there was about 500 people in this session. And when we took it, we foreigners were all down front. I don't know if you've been to Brazil or seen how it's organized, but these temples are circular, and they have tiers. They have tiers of steps on the inside, and there are chairs arrayed in in a circle around the central table where the mestres are, the mestres who are administering the ayahuasca. So we were down toward the front, kind of. And when I took this journey with the UDV, I had limited experience with ayahuasca. I had been to Peru. I had done my research on it, but I wasn't really that familiar with it. And I had very profound experience with ayahuasca at that time. You might call it the biochemist nerds inside tour of photosynthesis, which we were talking about yesterday. So back at the conference, after 3 days of PowerPoints and roundtables at a UDV temple on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, the event culminated in an ayahuasca ceremony with the foreign dignitaries as the guests of honor. About 500 people took part in that ceremony. I had a profound visionary revelation in which I experienced photosynthesis from a molecule's eye view and understood the importance of this everyday miracle for the sustenance of life on this planet. It was a cathartic and moving experience, one of my most profound ayahuasca journeys. The following account of my lessons from the teacher has been adapted from an earlier version that appeared in Ayahuasca Reader, Encounters with the Sacred Vine. And in light of our discussions yesterday about photosynthesis and its importance and some of the beautiful testimony that people gave this morning, I thought this was maybe an appropriate thing to talk about. Okay, so on the night in question, the weather was humid and balmy. In the gathering dusk, we all walked the short distance from the dormitories where we had been staying to the temple, nestled in a small valley about a quarter mile away. In the center of the amphitheater-like space, a long table was arranged, with chairs arrayed around and a picture of Mr. Gabriel, the UDV founder and prophet. hung beneath an arch-shaped structure decorated with the sun, moon, and stars at one end. Several gallons of Huasca tea, a brownish liquid the color of cafe latte, was in a plastic juice dispenser placed on the table beneath the picture of Mestre Gabriel. Beside it was a stack of paper picnic cups. A special set of chairs had been reserved for the visiting dignitaries along one of the terrace-like elevations close to the center of the amphitheater. We threaded our way among the members already seated, and took our places in the reserved spot. After everyone had gotten settled, the mestre in charge rose to start dispensing the brew, helped by a couple of acolytes. The members formed an orderly line, and one by one we filed down to stand before the mestre and be handed a paper cup containing our allotted draught. The size of the servings varied from person to person and seemed to be measured according to body weight and the mestre's assessing gaze. One got the feeling that he was taking the measure of the soul and spirit of the supplicant standing before him. Each person took their cup and returned to stand in front of their chair. Once everyone had been served, the mestre gave a signal, and all raised the cups to their lips and drained the bitter, foul-tasting beverage in 2 or 3 gulps. One of the Brazilian scientists standing beside me slipped me a small piece of ginger to chew to kill the aftertaste. I was grateful for the kind gesture. Having drained their cups, everyone sat back in their comfortable web chairs. I kept hoping someone would turn off the glaring, buzzing, fluorescent lights overhead that were altogether too bright and quite annoying. They were to stay on during the entire evening, however. For about 45 minutes, everyone sat absorbed in their own thoughts. The crowded hall was absolutely silent. After this period, a few people began to get up and totter toward the bathrooms as the nausea, a frequent side effect of the early stages, began to take hold. About the same time, the mestre began singing a beautiful song called the chamada, and though I could not understand the Portuguese words, the melody was quite moving. The sound of the heartfelt chamada mingling with the retching, gasping noises of people throwing up violently in the background made me smile at the incongruity, but no one else seemed to notice. My own experience was not developing as I'd hoped. My stomach was queasy, but not enough to send me to the bathroom, and I felt restless and uncomfortable. I felt very little effect except for some brief flashes of hypnagogia behind my closed eyes. I was disappointed. I had been hoping for more than a sub-threshold experience. When the mestre signaled that he was ready to give a second glass to anyone who wanted it, I was among the group of about a dozen gringos that queued up in front of his table. Apparently, I was not the only one who was having a difficult time connecting to the spirit of the tea. I took my second drink and settled back into my chair. It tasted as, if possible, even worse than the first one had. Within a few minutes, it became clear that this time it was going to work. I began to feel the force of the Huasca course through my body, a feeling of energy passing from the base of my spine to the top of my head. It was like being borne upwards in a high-speed elevator. I welcomed the sensation as confirmation that the train was pulling out of the station. The energized feeling and the sensation of rapid acceleration continued. It was much like mushrooms, but seemed to be much stronger. I had the sense that this was one elevator it would be hard to exit before reaching the top floor, wherever that might be. Random snippets of topics we had been discussing at the seminars in the previous days began to float into my consciousness. I remembered one seminar that had addressed the UDV's concept that the power of Huasca tea is a combination of force and light. The force was supplied by the MAO-inhibiting Banisteriopsis vine, known as mariri in the local vernacular, while the light, the visionary hypnagogic component, was derived from chacuna, the DMT-containing Psychotria admixture plant. I thought to myself, what an apt characterization this was. Huasca was definitely a combination of force and light, and at that moment I was well within the grip of the force and hoped that I was about to break into the light. At that instant I had that thought, I heard a voice seeming to come from behind my left shoulder. It said something like, "You want to see force? I'll show you force." The question was clearly rhetorical, and I understood that I was about to experience something whether I wanted to or not. The next instant, I found myself changed into a disembodied point of view, suspended in space, thousands of miles over the Amazon basin. I could see the curvature of the earth. The stars beyond showed steadily against the inky backdrop, and far below I could see swirls and eddies of clouds over the basin, and the nerve-like tracery of vast river systems. From the center of the basin rose the world tree in the form of an enormous Banisteriopsis vine. It was twisted into a helical form, and its flowering tops were just below my disembodied viewpoint. Its base was anchored to the earth far below, lost to vision in the depths of mists and clouds and distance that stretched between us, beneath me. As I gazed awestruck at this vision, the voice explained that the Amazon was the omphalos of the planet, and that the twisted rope-like Yggdrasil Mariri world tree was the linchpin that tied the three realms, the underworld, the earth, and the sky together. Somehow I understood, though no words were involved, that the Banisteriopsis vine was the embodiment of the plant intelligence that embraced and covered the earth. That together the community of the plant species that existed on the earth provided a nurturing energy that made life on earth possible. I understood that photosynthesis, that neat trick known only to green plants of making complex organic compounds from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, was the force the UDV was talking about, and indeed was the force on which all life depends. I was reminded of the line from Dylan Thomas, that photosynthesis is the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. In the next moment, I found myself instantly transported from my bodiless perch in space to the lightless depths beneath the surface of the earth. I had somehow become, a sentient water molecule percolating randomly through the soil, and lost amid the tangle of the enormous root fibers of the Banisteriopsis world tree. I could feel the coolness, the dampness of the soil surrounding me. I felt suspended in an enormous underground cistern, a single drop among billions of drops. This sensation lasted only a minute. Then I felt a definite sense of movement as squeezed by the implacable forces of irresistible osmotic pressures. I was rapidly translocated into the roots of the Banisteriopsis tree. The sense of the rising, speeding elevator returned, except this time I was being lifted rapidly through the vast pipes and tubes of the plant's vascular system. I was a single molecule of water tumbling through the myriad branches and forks of the vertical maze, which grew progressively narrower the higher I went. Finally, the sense of accelerating vertical movement eased off. I was now floating freely in a horizontal direction, no longer feeling pushed. I was suspended in the middle of a stream, flowing through an enormous vaulted tunnel. More than that, there was light at the end of the tunnel, a green light. With a start, I realized that I had just passed through the petiole of a sun-drenched leaf and was being shunted into progressively narrowing arteries as I was carried through the articulating veins toward some unknown destination. It helped that the voice, or my own narrative self, I'm not sure which, was providing occasional commentary on the stages of the journey as it unfolded. Desperately, I tried to remember my old lessons in plant physiology and anatomy. By this time, I had been given the wordless understanding that I was about to witness, indeed participate in, the central mystery of life on Earth. A water molecule's view of the process of photosynthesis. Suddenly, I was no longer suspended in the arterial stream of the leaf vein. I had somehow been transported into an enormous closed space, suffused with greenish light. Above me, I could see the domed, vaulted roof of the structure I was inside of, and I understood that I was inside a chloroplast. The roof was translucent, and beams of sunlight streamed through it like a bedroom window on a bright morning. In front of me were flat, layered structures looking like folded sheets stacked closely together, covered with antenna-shaped structures, all facing in the same direction, and all opened eagerly to receive the incoming light. I realized that these had to be the thylakoid membranes, the organelles within the chloroplast where the so-called light reaction takes place. The antenna-like structures covering them literally glowed and hummed with photonic energy. I could see that somehow this energy was being translocated through the membranes of the thylakoids they were mounted on. I recognized or understood that these antenna-like arrays were molecules of chlorophyll, and that the anchors that tied them to their membrane substrates were long tails of phytic acid that functioned as energy transducers, funneling the light energy collected by the flower-shaped receptors through the membranes and into the layers beneath it. Next thing I knew, I was beneath that membrane. I was being carried along as though borne on a conveyor belt. I could see the phytic acid chains dangling above and beyond them through the semi-transparent roof of the membrane, the flower-like porphyrin rings that formed the chlorophyll's light-gathering apparatus, loomed like the dishes of a radio telescope array. In the center of the space was what looked like a mottled flat surface, periodically being smited by enormous bolts of energy that emanated lightning-like from the phytic acid tails suspended above it. And on that altar, water molecules were being smashed to smithereens by the energy blasts. Consciousness exploded and died in a spasm of electron ecstasy as I was smited by the bolt of energy emitted by the phytic acid transducers, and my poor water molecule soul was split asunder. As the light energy was used to ionize the water, the oxygen liberated in the process rose with a shriek to escape from the chamber of horrors, while the electrons, liberated from their matrix, were shunted into the electron transport roller coaster, sliding down the chain of cytochromes like a dancer being passed from partner to partner, and into the waiting arms of photosystem 1, only to be blasted again by yet another photonic charge, bounced into the close but fleeting embrace of ferredoxin, the primary electron acceptor, ultimately captured by NADP+, to be used as bait to capture two elusive protons as a flame draws a moth to a candle. Suddenly I was outside the flattened thylakoid structures, which from my perspective looked like high-rise circular apartment buildings. I recognized that I was suspended in the stroma, the region outside the thylakoid membranes where the mysterious dark reaction takes place. The alchemical wedding, where the mysterious dark reaction takes place, the alchemical wedding that joins carbon dioxide to ribulose diphosphate, a shotgun marriage presided over by ribulose diphosphate, carboxylase, the first enzyme in the so-called pentose phosphate shunt. All was quiet, and for a moment I was floating free in darkness. Then, miraculously, miracles were by this time mundane. I realized that my disembodied point of view had been reincarnated again and was now embedded in the matrix of the newly reduced ribulose diphosphate carbon dioxide complex. The unstable intermediate was rapidly falling apart into two molecules of phosphoglycerate, which were grabbed and loaded on the merry-go-round by the first enzymes of the Calvin cycle. Dimly, I struggled to remember my early botany lessons and put names to what I was seeing. I recognized that I had entered the first phase of the pentose phosphate shunt, the biochemical pathway that builds the initial products of photosynthesis into complex sugars and sends them spinning from thence into the myriad pathways of biosynthesis that ultimately generate the molecular stuff of life. You'll have to excuse me, this kind of gets me emotional. Only a biochemist would. But there it is. I felt humbled, shaken, exhausted, and exalted all at the same time. Suddenly, I was ripped out of my molecular roller coaster ride, and my disembodied I was again suspended high over the Amazon basin. This time, there was no world tree arising from its center. It looked much like it must look from a spacecraft in orbit. The day was sunny, the vista stretching to the curved horizon was blue and green and bluish green. The vegetation below, threaded with shining rivers, looked like green mold covering an overgrown petri plate. Suddenly I was racked with a sense of overwhelming sadness. Sadness mixed with fear for the delicate balance of life on this planet. The fragile processes that drive and sustain life, sadness for the fate of our planet, and its precious cargo. What will happen? What will happen if we destroy the Amazon? I thought to myself, what will become of us? What will become of life itself? If we allow this to happen, if we allow this destruction to continue, we cannot let this happen. It must be stopped at any cost. I was weeping. I felt miserable. I felt anger and rage directed toward my own rapacious, destructive species, scarcely aware of its own devastating power. A species that cares little about the swath of destruction it leaves in its wake as it thoughtlessly decimates ecosystems and burns thousands of acres of rainforest. I was filled with loathing and shame. Suddenly, again from behind my left shoulder, came a quiet voice. "You monkeys only think you're running things," it said. "You don't think we would really allow this to happen, do you?" And somehow I knew that the "we" in this statement was the entire community of species. That constitute the planetary biosphere. I knew that I had been given an inestimable gift, a piece of gnosis and wisdom straight from the heart-mind of planetary consciousness, planetary intelligence, conveyed in visions and brought and thought by an infinitely wise, incredibly ancient, and enormously compassionate ambassador to the human community. A sense of relief, tempered with hope, washed over me. The vision faded, and I opened my eyes to see my newfound friends and hosts all eagerly gathered around me. The ceremony had officially ended a few minutes earlier. I had been utterly oblivious to whatever was going on in the world beyond my closed eyelids. How was it, they said? How was it, they wanted to know? Did you feel the Chorrera, the strange force? I smiled to myself, feeling overjoyed at the prospect of sharing the experience and knowing that I had indeed been allowed to experience the ultimate force, the vastly alien, incredibly complex molecular machine that is the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. Thank you. I'm not acting, 20 years later, this still just gets to me very deeply. And I think that, I think that this is one of the things that psychedelics teach us, one of the reasons that psychedelics are re-emerging in planetary consciousness because of this, the ecological urgency. This is the message that they are trying to get us to wake up to. Many people who have experienced ayahuasca, especially, being this sort of ambassador from the center of biodiversity on the planet, have not necessarily this experience, but they come away with a profound, sort of the lesson gets told to them very forcefully that nature is extremely precious. We have only one planet. We can't let this incredible gem of a planet be destroyed by the corporatization, by the rapacious activity of soulless governments and soulless corporations. We have to fight this. We have to fight it. These medicines are one way, or maybe the best way to do that, because they truly do change hearts and minds. People have these experiences and they change their lives and they go forward and they teach other people. And this is what I meant yesterday. These are our bioweapons. This is what we can fight back with. They're weapons in the sense that, they don't kill people, but they change hearts and minds, and that's what's got to happen. That's what has to happen. And, I'm a scientist by training, but I'm a human being, and there is an intuition, I think, that we all have, at least those of us who have been close to ayahuasca, that, there is an intelligence, that the planet itself is intelligent, and it knows that it is in deep trouble. And, we would like to think, we would like to believe that life is common in the universe. I believe it. I think that civilizations and life permeates the galaxy, permeates even beyond the galaxy, but we have no way of knowing, and we've never found another ecosystem that we could definitively say was a living ecosystem. This is the only one we have, and this is where we live, and we're really screwing it up, and we have to do something about that. And mostly we have to raise consciousness, and I think that's where these medicines come in. We're at this enormous, incredibly important historical and cultural transition where if enough people get the message, then things will change. And that's what these medicines can do. That's why these medicines have come out of the Amazon and other places to give us the message and say, basically, get this, people. You monkeys don't know anything, are not running things. You only think you're running things. You don't know shit. So sit down, shut up, and prepare to learn. And I think that's got to be the message that we propagate to the rest of the world. Thank you. Not you, of course. You are all incredibly beautiful, enlightened beings. You got the message. So that's not directed at you. That's directed at those other people who are not here, unfortunately. Okay. Thank you.